Jack. How are you? And we have a great guest today, don't we?
We do. We have, well, I know you as adopted Connor. I don't actually know your last name.
Yeah, I mean, it
This is
depends
the-
on which birth certificate.
Pardon me?
Depends on the birth certificate.
This is true. This is a problem that us adoptees have. Like you find out you have one, two, sometimes more names. So we're just going to go with Connor. This is Connor.
I'm
Uh,
Connor Howe. You can call me Connor Howe.
okay, Connor Howe. Um, I've been following, stalking Connor of sorts online, mostly because I've got into the adoptee circle. I had my coming out of the fog moments, as we call it, several years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, when it really hit me big. Um, and I ended up online, Instagram, and like most social media and most issues, the predominance of posters and influencers out there are female. And there's very few males. I've happened to, stumble across a few here and there. But Connor's one that really, you came on the scene, as far as I know, a couple years ago. When did you really start posting as you have been?
Actually, a year ago this month. So, yeah,
Yeah,
just about a
so
year.
you have made meteoric rises on your platform with some of your messages. And I just want to introduce everyone to Connor Howe. Um, and if any of you know my story as an adoptee, I have my book out called Recycled. But like I said, Connor is someone who jumped out at me online. Yeah, there we go. And Connor's made a big splash in the world. He tends to take no shit and give plenty of it, which a lot of adoptees need. There's many different practices within the adoptee community um, that have affected a lot of us deeply and adversely. And Connor takes them on. So Connor, I'm just going to pass it on to you. You explain and define yourself however you like, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was adopted as an infant. I know of Jack that you were adopted in a closed adoption, baby scoop era. I was adopted in the 1990s when I was born. So I was adopted in kind of the first wave of open adoptions and grew up knowing who my mom was, biological mom, I should say, I guess, for clarification. Um, probably saw her about once a year, give or take, for the first 18 or so years of my life. Didn't really have a say in kind of what that relationship looked like. I don't really think anyone in my life really understood what that should look like or kind of what the goal was. It was kind of just like this is better than closed adoption where people are completely information restricted. Um, and so I never really felt like I had the voice to say how I felt or to ask the questions I wanted to ask or if I wanted to see my mom more, to be like, hey, I want to see my mom more. I mean, it took me 30 years to start even referring to her as just my mom without the caveat of, birth mom or whatever. And so, yeah, I mean, and then on the other side of my family, I have a biological father in Ireland. My mom got pregnant as a teenager living in Ireland, and he's a complete, question mark. I've never met him. I've never met any of my siblings on that side of the family. I only know kind of one or two things about him, and one of those things being that he basically doesn't want anything to do with me. So, yeah, kind of a really complicated life story, and growing up feeling a lot of complicated emotions and not really having any sort of, my adoptive family tried to get me in therapy and they did what they thought they could to try to help me figure out a lot of this stuff. But growing up, 1990s, 2000s, even 2010s, and even really in the 2020s, like I wouldn't say many therapists or obviously like the broad population, but definitely therapists. Most therapists don't really understand the complexities of being an adopted person. And then you add on top of that being in like an open adoption. It's like not to say that that's more difficult as a therapist to talk about, but like I mean, this
Well,
is like a brand new experience. So
yeah, I think,
yeah.
my story was similar, and I think all of our stories are similar, but it's 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 highlighted by the fact that you don't know that there are questions to ask. You
Yeah.
don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of adoptees are misled or and I try not to take sides. I have empathy for all members of the triad, the child, the adoptive parents, and the birth parents, and even to a certain degree to the fourth leg of the table, which is the adoption entities, the organizations that are tasked with placing these children. But I think the biggest misnomer, the biggest problem that we face is that you're told right from the beginning, you're blessed, you're lucky, you're chosen, you're this special child that dropped from heaven in this immaculate conception of some sort. And whatever situation you're in, um, as an infant, as a child, um, it's irrelevant, whether it's good or bad. You're just made to feel that you need to be grateful for that. Now, looking back into your younger years, were you plagued with that with the open adoption? Because that's something that's different from my experience.
Oh yeah. I mean, definitely I think every adopted person has this kind of, I mean, I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I think most adopted people I've interacted with have felt that kind of obligation, the need to be grateful. Certainly when I was a kid and anytime I had any issues in life, it was always like stop being a victim, like, we're putting food on the table, we're putting a roof over your head. And then on top of that, there's kind of the adoption layer of like, what would your life be like if you weren't in this house? And I don't really think my adoptive family necessarily waved that over my head all the time, but it was definitely, no one has to say anything for an adopted person to feel that. Like
Mhm.
even if like I have an adoptive brother who was born 4 months after I was adopted. So basically like kind of an Irish twin situation. And I mean, they try to treat us exactly the same. But that's impossible. It's an impossible task, and definitely when you're the person that feels like I'm the one that's different here. I'm the one that gets sunburned when no one else gets sunburned. I'm the one that, has these things that like I don't look like anyone else. I don't I'm the very socially different than everyone else. Like it just yeah, it's a huge difference and you can't help but feel like the black sheep and feeling like again that this whatever life I have, whatever complicated feelings I have, whether positive, negative, both, or just negative, whatever, like I felt like at every stage of my life like I had to be grateful, like I was this almost like I think I said in another podcast like that I was kind of this like I'm the poster child of open adoption, like I'm first generation open adoption kind of. I mean, it was like it was only became a thing in the 1970s and really did not was not popular at all for decades after that. And so like to be one of the first generations and to know that there's adoption agencies out there talking about open adoption is great because look at people like Connor, right? And
Right.
it felt like I have to have this pressure of yeah, I mean even as a kid too
Making
with the
that
pro-life.
you had to almost make the dreams come true, the other people's dreams come true, you
Yeah,
know,
I made the
despite
dreams come true, so I have to also be like, have my political attitudes on the pro-life, pro-choice stuff because, God wanted you to be in this family, even though, I later learned in life my mom was never choosing between those two things. But
right,
as a kid growing up in the church, that's kind of this is what I'm supposed to believe. And I think that was a big thing for me is not necessarily that I disagree with every single detail of the beliefs of the people I grew up with or who I consider family, but I never really felt like I was in a position to kind of have my own experience. I felt like
right.
I
And
was really put into this position of this is your role.
right. And as a child, you shouldn't be, and when I break down my book, I break it down into, nurture, nature, and free will. And I did that and I kind of put the nurture and nature backwards because that's how I experienced it. Most people say nature, nurture, free will. Um, but my experience was, my nurturing was my first experience with the real world, you know. But meanwhile, the program that was running in the background was all my nature, a lot of it, those things that I got from my birth parents, those things that, I got from generations and thousands of years before me, the eyebrows, the eyes, the personalities, the aptitudes. But you often, as you're being taught these things and you're surrounded by, I mean, I had, my two grandparents, and then they had four children. And of those four children, there were 21 cousins in the or 13 cousins in the next generation, and then they soon, so everybody was biologic except for me, and my sister. Um, and I kind of place adoptees into two broad categories of hyper assimilator and rebel. And it seems to me that there are those people pleasers, those brown noses that, I personally, feel like I became the ultimate Italian. Like if there was something that had to be Italian, I was 130% Italian. There's always that overachiever mindset of I can't just be me in this role. I need to really emphasize and exaggerate that. Now, did you, I mean, you as, and I knew I was adopted. Some of my bombshells came later in life when I found my birth parents and, the history I had been given, the ethnicity I'd been given, and the race that I'd been given, um, ended up being different. So, there's those early challenges and then the late challenges. But going back to your early years, like the fact that you knew your mother, did that give you some comfort in knowing your nature?
I would say, I've heard a lot of adopted people talk about uh, close adopted people, I should say, that the first time they meet someone in their family and they have this profound feeling of like, finally, I have genetic mirroring, and that changes everything for me because I see my mom's face, right? And for me, like, I don't want to say they're wrong necessarily. Like, my experience, I had a picture of my mom on my bedside table, like I had at least one present that I remember that she gave me. She gave me like a necklace that I literally would never take off. And things like that meant a lot. Like it meant a lot to know that she existed, but it didn't really feel like she was a part of my life. I probably saw her less than 5 hours a year. So I feel like that for me wasn't really enough to feel like I would search for myself. Sometimes recognized it and sometimes I didn't. But definitely as I've gotten older in life and I have, younger siblings in that family, I see my mom a lot. Like I really can see myself in my family to an extent where I feel like this is something that I didn't have for many years of my life. And now having a kid too, like I can see it in my kid's face. Like this
Right.
is like family in a way that I've never experienced
Right.
it.
I mean, what do you
Yeah.
think? And I'm listening to both of you being adopted. What if you were loved and you had a great relationship? What kind of goes back to why wanting to know who your adopted parents? I've learned from you, Dr. J.
Yeah.
This question's more for you, Connor. Why? I mean, I look at, I have a different belief system in the way family is not blood. It's family is you can count on a regular basis
Sure.
every day. And if I had my adopted family, if was adopted and they did everything for me and it was a great relationship, what would make you think differently about yourself because of that?
Yeah, I think being adopted is a really unique like feeling experience. Something that I don't think people who haven't lived it can really like put themselves in those shoes. I would equate it to like if you I mean, you guys might be too old to be like big gamers or anything, but like if you're creating a character in a video game, right? And you can choose the hair color, you can choose the eye color. Like everyone who plays a game, I shouldn't say everyone, but most people who play a game and they have that choice, they're gonna be like, okay, I want to make my guy look like this, right? Whether it's funny, whether the guy looks like me, whether it's whatever, right? But in adoption, you don't like, I know that no one chooses the way they look, right? But like, you really don't like, it's just the way that I feel like I came out was just like sometimes you can press like a randomized button, like you press X and it's just like random features and then you continue and it's like who wants to play like that with a guy who has like giant blue afro or whatever and like like a guy that just looks like a complete mismatch. But that's kind of how it feels like, at least for me being an adopted person growing up. I grew up in a family that like I could like pass quote unquote as like a biological child. I mean, I definitely don't look like them, but we're all white, so it's like who's gonna really be like that guy's clearly adopted. Like it just people don't really like look at you like that. But I think it's really a matter of like not recognizing something in yourself that I think a lot of people kind of take for granted. Like I have had this experience throughout my whole life, and it's not every night, but I mean, there are definitely plenty of times where I'm just looking at myself in the mirror and I'm like what is this reflection looking back at me? Something doesn't look right. And it's not that I don't look wrong. I mean, there's definitely days where I'm like, I'm too fat or whatever, but like everyone has that feeling. But there's something about the way my eyes are, the way my eyebrows are, the way my mouth is. It's just something that feels totally intangible where it's like, why do I
Yeah.
feel like this about looking at myself? It doesn't make
Oh,
sense.
Neil, yeah, I mean, I'm glad to see Neil put you under the gun because when people put me under that same gun, it is an unexplainable feeling. It's that missing piece. It's that hole in your center that you can't scratch it. It's the itch you can't scratch. And and then we all hear the same stories, but like the people that really make me believe that it's a thing are the NPEs. Now, NPE, Neil, is considered, they call it non-parent expected. These are the guys in their 40s and 50s, men and women, that in their 40s and 50s, 60s, they suddenly find out that they were adopted this whole time. They thought they were a real kid, quote unquote, real kid. Um, and you know, for me, it's the Truman moment. It's
Hmm.
the Truman moment where you're like, something just wasn't right. Something just was, for these NPEs, they've lived their whole life under this guise, under this, and the words we all use, the words we all use, like chameleonization, looking in the mirror, staring in your eyes, it's something that all adoptees do. Um, and those who aren't adoptees would never consider doing. So that there's something about that initial trauma, that occurs upon separation from your birth mother, that the thing that's unique about it is that your brain is not fully developed. Your cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain that makes you human, is not fully developed. So basically, you just have a lizard brain. You have that brain stem, which teaches you how to breathe, eat, sleep, fart, all those basic functions, but it doesn't tell you to think, and you rely on your mother and you rely on your family and and then slowly as your outer brain, most people, as your outer brain starts to develop, then you work into this self, this sense of self, and I think the early child, and it's very hard to study, but the inner child has this trauma that is deep seated in their brain stem, so that when they're often triggered or when they think it's at a guttural level. The trauma is at a guttural level that is not explainable. And it's got to be, you imagine as an infant who's been bonding with their mother for 9 months in the wound, they've been hearing the voice, they've been feeling the electric, they've been just smells, tastes, you're like this the salmon, the salmon know where to swim up, what stream to swim up because they smell it, they taste it. Um, and our brains are much more complex than a salmon. But it's just that knowledge of yourself and that knowledge of your stream, your soil, your foundation. And then, you're born, and instead of going back to that foundation and saying and getting comfort and getting, learning and training, you're taken from your stream. You're put in a fish bowl, you're put in an incubator, you're sent to an orphanage, you're sent to a foster home, you're sent to another foster home. And it's this bouncing around that really never allows you to merge that brain stem with the outer brain cortex, if that makes sense. I'm trying to explain it on a neurologic level, but it's very difficult, but it's something we all share. And I've been to not many, but I've been to a few adoptee conferences where you have 30, 40, 100 other adoptees in the room, and everyone is like, yes, yes, yes. Whether it was a quote unquote good adoption, bad adoption, good upbringing, whether you're an assimilator or a rebel, there's that understanding of, yeah, I know what it's like to grow up without a left arm. Like it's almost a birth defect in a sense that, you don't have your mother. You're not born with your cultural and genetic history. What do you think about that, Connor? You agree with just that it's an unscratchable itch.
Let me add one more thing going back to that question you asked, Neil, which is like I would also say if you ever do like a DNA test, like on 23andMe, I've done it on a few of them. On 23andMe, they're able now to be like, this is 50% of you comes from this person, 50% of you comes from this person. You can kind of even see, like, I mean, 23andMe isn't gonna know which one's your mom, which one's your dad. But I know like, okay, my mom is this side, my dad is this side. And when you grow up and you're adopted, especially if you don't have access to like one of your, biological parents, like I would is like you're cut in half, right? I know this side of me comes from my mom, right? Like I can kind of, okay, I have brown hair, my mom has brown hair. That's something I know that like I can imagine that probably comes from someone. There's this other half of me that's just like a black question mark. Like what do I know about myself besides that my dad's from Ireland? I don't know where in Ireland he's from. I don't know where he is. I don't know whether he's alive. I don't know if I have siblings. I don't know if I have grandparents. I don't know anything about that I come from. And going back to kind of what you mentioned about, a family being chosen, like I think it's very like I don't have an issue necessarily with people saying, "Oh, well, family is chosen," but we refer to people as deadbeat dads. We talk about, oh, my family was this, my family was that. People who aren't adopted and have these normal experiences, in most cases, I would say, I mean, obviously, in some cases, they'll say, well, that person's not my parent anymore. They're just my sperm donor, whatever they want to say, whatever pejorative they come up with. But people still kind of refer to those people as parents. They're like, oh, my dad should have been better. My mom should have been better. I feel like there's only really this desire to erase that familial connection when it comes to adoption. Adoption was, going back to the way that it actually was conceived in this country. It was literally, in the 1920s, it was basically not even a thing. It was a few adoptions per year at each adoption agency. I think like the Boston, whatever the one in Boston was doing like 5 adoptions per year. It cost $7 to adopt. In today's money, that's like less than $200. And then a human trafficker came along named Georgia Tan in the 1920s and decided that she could make a lot of money facilitating adoptions. And so she basically commercialized adoption, turned it into a consumer-driven business, which is why adoption is so expensive today. It's why birth certificates were sealed, because originally she would kidnap children, and the way that she was able to conceal the crimes that she committed was by destroying that legal connection between the child and the parents that the child was kidnapped from. And so a lot of the modern practices that exist in adoption, even a lot of the cultural kind of ideas about what family is, like I wouldn't say that family isn't chosen to some degree. Like certainly, my kid has 3 sets of grandparents, maybe four if my kid meets my dad one day, But like I definitely agree that people should be able to choose family, but I think that there is a dangerous line when it comes to people talking about blood doesn't make a family, because blood, for most people, constitutes some level of family. It really is only used as a form of erasure when it comes to adoption, because when adoption was first becoming this big institution, kind of like marketplace, it was advertised as if we can, cut this connection between the child and the family, this child is entirely yours. They're a blank slate. And I know that Jack mentioned in his in the beginning of his book, like kind of the tabula rasa theory of we can just kind of pretend this kid came from nowhere, from no one,
That's
and present them as if they're born to you. And it's literally like on this. I have 2 birth certificates. One of them says that I was pushed out of one woman's womb, and then the other birth certificate says I was pushed out of a different woman's womb. It's a
yeah.
very interesting experience, but
Yeah, it
yeah,
really
it's
is.
that's the
It's
thing is it just adoption makes this really complicated family dynamic that every adopted person has to deal with, whether it's open or closed or whatever it looks like.
Yeah. And the other thing, Connor, like now let's get into the men's realm of things. One of your posts that you recently put out, I thought was fantastic. It was a woman talking about she had a relationship with an adopted man, and she was like trashing adoptees, saying if you're going to date an adopted man, um, just beware, that, and I do think that, I mean, I personally certainly had difficulties with relationships. And later in life, once you go through when you sift through the rubble, and you're like, what the hell went wrong? Everything was perfect. What the hell went wrong? Like, for me, it's like, dude, I made it through residency. I made it through the military. I pledged a fraternity. I went through all these hardships. How hard could it be to get married? I'll get married and I'll just figure it out. Well, when you're dealing with emotions and what I consider your nature, and if you don't know yourself, how do you present yourself to another? So do you find, what are your thoughts on your experience and others' experiences you've heard as far as men and their relationships? Because men, we try to please others, I think. I make generalities often, which is probably not right for me to do. But in general, I think, men are seeking the attention of a female. You're going to put out your best foot forward, you know. And when you don't know what your best foot is, when you don't know yourself, you literally don't know yourself. I mean, for me, the closed adoption system, you definitely didn't know yourself. You had no idea. My dreams of my birth parents went from living on a train as a hobo to being Queen of England. Who knows? Maybe Daddy Warbucks is going to show up someday. Um, but I said, how do you deal with being in relationships when you don't really know yourself? Like, do you see that being an issue with men that you're
Yeah, I mean, growing up, it's like I feel like being adopted is just crazy because you kind of hear everything. I don't remember who or what, in my life would say whatever things that were said about adopted people. But like, I definitely grew up believing that, in that video you referenced, one of the things she said was she was like, and to be fair, I mean, she might have just been kind of like drama farming or like trying to make a video that got a bunch of clicks or whatever. I try not to take things personal when I see them on the internet, but like she basically said something along the lines of like adopted men have huge abandonment wounds and they're very bad at like handling rejection. I'm sorry if my kid's making noise in the background. I don't know if you can tell that. But basically, like for me, it's always been extremely difficult to tolerate rejection. I mean, I think my entire life has been shaped by my deep desire to avoid rejection at all costs. And obviously, adoption, whether someone would argue it's an actual rejection or not, certainly to an infant and a child at the very least, to some form of rejection, right? The infant, all of a sudden the mother isn't there, right? If you're a child and your mother's not there, or your father's not there, or both, or whatever, like that, you can't as a child, as a 5-year-old. I mean, maybe you have an adoptive family that's really, really, really good at explaining that stuff. I mean, I have a kid who's like almost 3. I can't imagine trying to explain to a kid in a year, oh, by the way, here's kind of how all of that happened in a way that the child doesn't feel some form of rejection. And so, I remember growing up and playing sports, and I was really good at basketball. And the second it became too much, and I felt like, I wasn't going to be where I expected to be, and like I felt like it was a rejection from my coaches that, I'm not going to be on the JV team freshman year. I quit the day, high school basketball started when I was basically on track to play college basketball. And I think things like that, I can look back in my life and just see every single thing that I did was not, I mean, not every, but like every major decision I feel like I made in my life was an attempt to avoid some form of rejection. I remember going to college and wanting to like, I wanted to be as far away from where I grew up, San Diego, as possible because I just know I want to be anywhere near like like my adoptive family that I grew up with. Nothing against them personally. I just wanted to do my own thing. And I went as far away as I could, Los Angeles. Like, I mean, I could not bring myself to do something that I wanted to do because I was afraid that if I went too far away from home, that I would be rejected by people who, I mean, there were definitely times in my life where I felt like a rejection would be coming from them based on things they may have said or done. But like
Mhm.
there was just always this rejection fear in the back of my head. And I think like as a kid and when you grow up hearing that the reason that you're adopted is because, you like in that video again to reference back like there's something she said about like that the people who are adopted, like, oh, your parents knew what you were going to turn out to be, and that's why
Right.
they relinquished you for adoption, right?
Yeah.
And obviously that's just an impossibility, right? My mom doesn't feel like this evil inside of me when she's pregnant with me. Like whatever pregnancy decisions she makes has to do with her or me or kind of what she wants for her or what she wants for me. It's not like she feels this, evil inside of this evil child that she knows is going to be bad. So let me get rid of this child and push him onto someone else. Like that's just not the way that adoption decision making works. But when you're a kid, you can grow up feeling like the reason why I was adopted is because my parents knew that I
Oh, yeah.
was, a faulty
And these are,
person.
like you said, you're misinterpreting things that are intended to be good. But what about I had one of my friends from high school after the book came out. He said something like, he goes, Jack, I was thinking back and I remember senior year when you told me you were adopted. I was like, no way, you're not adopted. So he goes, then he told me, he goes, I'm going to start calling you the trash can kid, you know? And I'm like, nah, I wasn't the trash can kid. But then you brush those things off and who knows where they launch. But we try to keep little short interviews here, Connor. We appreciate you being here. Um, and we can have you back to talk about more because, I just really wanted to introduce you to the Ultimate Men's Movement, as a man, as a young man, as a open adoption. I thought, you and I contrasted well for trying to explain. But, I do think like the number of men, boys, out there who were adopted, and if not adopted, still some element of childhood trauma that they carry with them. And I think, the way men deal with them and that post, really highlighted because if someone has a girl that's adopted, it's more of a compassionate thing, like, oh, this girl was given up, but she was taken into her family. But with boys, and especially this woman's comments, she's like, hey, your mother didn't even want you. What makes you think that I would want you, kind of thing, So, I think men, they take those things and they swallow them, like a lot of things that guys do. And, when you look at, we talk about, suicide risk and, wounded warriors and a lot of things. Um, and men, when they act on those things, they act on them in general. But, you know, uh, for me, you got your male increase in suicide risk. I've got my military risk. There's physicians who have risk. And adoptees, anytime you go through these things, male adoptees have higher rates, higher risks. Um, and I think a lot of it is just because men don't express those needs. So, for anyone in our audience who is adopted, was adopted, has some connection to it, as men, I do think that some of these childhood traumas that occur to men are handled differently. Once again, without the support, without the comfort in expressing those questions and concerns and inadequacies that we feel. But thank you for coming on. And if people want to get a hold, and I would encourage everyone to follow Connor's website because he like I said, he pulls no punches. We like guys on this show who don't pull punches. We're not necessarily PC, but when I told Zinta, I don't know if you know her from online, but I was talking to her earlier and I said, adoptee Connor is going to be on my show. And she's like, he's a smart cookie, that guy. And he calls it like it is. People respect and appreciate, the messages that you put out. But how do people follow you if they want to learn more about, some of your passions that you put out there?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it. Anyone can find me online at Adopted Connor. I mean, I always caveat it with like, I mean, not everyone wants to see a bunch of, negative stuff about adoption all the time. No, no pressure to follow me at all. Like, I mean, it's definitely I treat like kind of what I do as advocacy. And one thing I wanted to say, kind of just along the lines of what you're saying at the very end, Jack, about childhood trauma and men and all this stuff, is like you said, like adopted people in general, but obviously adopted men as well, are super overrepresented in like a lot of mental health issues in the criminal justice system, in the juvenile justice system, suicide risk and all that stuff. And I think a lot of people look at it as, and this probably applies to all childhood trauma, is the way that we usually respond is usually with like anger and aggression. And I think a lot of parents look at those responses and think, well, yeah, he's a boy. That's what they do, right? A girl is going to cry. A girl is going to kind of sit back or do something that maybe is more tangibly like, oh, something might be wrong with her. But I think a lot of parents are willing to kind of just like like not really pay as much of attention to men's mental health issues when we're children because yeah I mean it's just the way that our behaviors manifest or kind of maybe the lack of seriousness because yeah like you said men have to be men and we got to toughen up and all that stuff and just yeah to anyone who's out there listening like you're not alone and anyone who needs someone to talk to can always message me about adoption stuff or whatever people want to talk about but yeah find me on Adopted Connor if you want or not it's no pressure I appreciate you guys having me on I mean it
Yeah,
means a lot
thank
to
you
me to a
so
lot
much.
Appreciate
of
it.
But
people.
but you're
Thank
right. Yeah, girls will cry and it's like, oh, honey, come here. But boys will anger and lash out, and that's unacceptable. You get stuck in a corner and banished for life, right?
All
So
right.
thanks
All right.
again, Connor.
Thanks, Connor.
Yeah, thanks
All
for
right.
having me.
That was a spark. So, and remember to go to the ultimatemensmovement.com and the ultimate, we got to get that too. The ultimatemensclinic.com in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Appreciate it, guys.